Every year, on the same day, he comes. But why does he wait? Who is he waiting for? It's a question that has haunted the park for decades. People see him every year, without fail. An old man, dressed in a worn coat, his face marked by time, sitting on the same bench. The park bench has become his sanctuary, but there's something unsettling about his routine. He's always there, on November 4th, rain or shine, without a single word, without a single visitor. To most, he's just another lonely old man. But if you look closer, you'll see the pain in his eyes, the quiet longing he tries to hide. He never speaks of the past, but you can tell it weighs on him, like an invisible chain that keeps him bound to that very spot. He sits, patiently, year after year, as if expecting someone who never arrives. And yet every year, his faith remains unbroken. His routine never changes. There's no birthday celebration, no family gatherings, no special moments to mark the passage of time. Just the solitary ritual of waiting for something, someone, who promised to come back. What happened to the woman he waits for? Why hasn't she returned? Why does he still believe that one day she will? In the bustle of the world, it's easy to overlook the old man, to dismiss him as just another figure in the background. But those who've been watching closely for years wonder, what is his story? What promise keeps him tied to this spot, year after year? As you pass him, you can't help but feel a pull, a curiosity about the man who waits, a man who, against all odds, holds on to something more than time. A promise, perhaps, or love. But the truth, as they say, is often more than what meets the eye. And in the next few moments, you will begin to unravel the mystery that has kept him waiting for 50 long years. Some meetings change the course of our lives, even if we don't realize it at the time. The year was 1972. Edward had just finished his military training, the weight of the uniform feeling both foreign and permanent on his shoulders. He wasn't the same young man who had walked through the gates of the training camp months ago. The drills, the harsh commands, the endless march of days had worn away some of the softness from his soul, replacing it with a stoic resolve. The world outside the camp felt distant, disconnected, as if he no longer belonged to it. There was a quiet uncertainty in his heart about what came next. Would he become just another soldier, lost in the monotony of war and orders? Or was there something more to life waiting for him out there? One afternoon, while walking through the quiet streets of a small town, Edward found himself at the entrance of a small, charming library. The sign above the door read, "Community Library, Open. To all," in faded letters. Something about it called to him, and without thinking, he pushed the door open. Inside, the musty scent of old books greeted him, the warmth of the space offering a contrast to the coldness that had settled in his chest. He didn't expect to stay long. Books were things he had only touched in passing during his training, but something about the atmosphere, so peaceful, so removed from the chaos of military life, pulled him deeper inside. He wandered down the aisles, the quiet click of his boots against the floor, the only sound breaking the stillness. That's when he saw her. Clara was seated in the corner, surrounded by stacks of books. She wasn't looking at him. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the pages of a poetry book, the faint light from a nearby window casting a soft glow on her delicate features. There was an ethereal quality to her, as though she existed in a world of her own, untouched by the harshness of reality. Edward had never been one to approach strangers. He had learned to keep to himself, to remain distant. But something about Clara was different. She seemed like someone who could see beyond the uniform, someone who wouldn't judge him for the things he had already seen and done. "Excuse me," Edward said, his voice awkward but sincere. "Is that book any good?" Clara looked up, her eyes bright and welcoming, though they carried a depth that immediately intrigued him. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that didn't need words to be understood. "It's one of my favorites," she replied. "It's by Rainer Maria Rilke. It's about finding beauty in the quiet moments of life." Edward raised an eyebrow. He had never heard of Rilke, or any poet for that matter. But something about the way she spoke made him want to know more. "Sounds peaceful," he said, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. Clara laughed softly, the sound like music to his ears. "It is. Life doesn't always have to be loud to be meaningful." Those words, simple yet profound, stuck with him. Edward didn't know it at the time, but that moment would change the course of his life. Their conversations began with the smallest things: the weather, the books they enjoyed, their favorite spots in town. But as they talked, the connection between them grew. They found common ground in poetry, in classical music, in the ideas of philosophers who believed in peace, harmony, and the beauty of the world. It was a world so different from the one Edward had known, the world of violence and chaos, of soldiers marching into battle. Clara's world was soft, gentle, and filled with the kind of beauty Edward had forgotten existed. As days passed, their meetings became more frequent. Edward found himself visiting the library not just for books, but for Clara. He'd walk in, and she'd look up from her book with that same welcoming smile. He'd sit with her for hours, listening to her speak about the beauty of nature, the power of music to heal the soul, and the joy of being present in the moment. It was strange at first. Edward wasn't used to these kinds of conversations. He was more accustomed to loud voices, orders, and the heavy tension of war. But with Clara, the words flowed easily. She never judged him for his past. She never asked him about the things he had done. Clara's voice, soft and reassuring, offered him a glimpse into a different life, one that wasn't defined by the harshness of war, but by the quiet joys of simple moments. She spoke of nature's beauty, as if it were a language he had forgotten how to speak, and with each word, Edward felt like he was rediscovering a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. Their first few meetings were filled with a gentle shyness, a tentative dance around their pasts. Edward would tell Clara about his childhood, the little things he remembered, the smell of fresh grass, the sound of rain on the roof. Clara would share her thoughts on poetry and philosophy, her love of nature, and the way the world seemed to slow down when she took the time to really look at it. And as their meetings continued, the silence between them became comfortable. They didn't need to speak all the time. Just being in each other's presence felt like enough. For Edward, Clara was like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that there was still goodness in the world, still beauty, still hope. And though he couldn't admit it yet, he was beginning to care for her in a way that made his heart ache when they said goodbye. But he knew the inevitable was coming. His time in town was running out. The military would call him away, and he would have to leave behind the one thing that had given him peace in this chaotic world. But Clara had given him something even more important, the possibility of something different, something worth waiting for. Some promises are never truly spoken, yet their weight is felt in every heartbeat. The day Edward had been dreading had finally come. The orders had arrived. His time in the town was up. The military had called him back, and he had no choice but to obey. It was a strange feeling, knowing he would have to leave behind the quiet life he had just begun to embrace, the moments with Clara that had started to mean everything to him. It was early in the morning, the air crisp and filled with the promise of change. Edward stood at the train station, his military duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his gaze distant, as if trying to hold on to the very essence of the town. He had walked these streets for weeks, each corner, each shop, each quiet alley now etched in his memory. But the thought of leaving was unbearable, not because of the town or the military, but because of Clara. She had become a part of him, a part of his soul that he hadn't even known was missing. And now, just like that, she would be out of reach. Their time together had been brief, but in that time, something had grown between them, a bond that neither of them had fully understood until now. They hadn't spoken of love. In fact, they never had. The words felt too heavy, too final. But in every glance, every shared smile, every moment they spent together, their hearts had silently confessed what neither dared to say aloud. Clara arrived at the station just as the train began to rumble in the distance. She was wearing a light coat, her hair loosely pinned back, and there was an air of quiet sadness around her. She walked towards Edward slowly, as though each step was a struggle. Her face was calm, but there was a glint of unshed tears in her eyes, tears that she was determined not to shed in front of him. They stood in silence for a moment, neither one of them knowing exactly what to say. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice soft but firm. "If we are truly serious about this, about what we've found in each other, then maybe we should promise something," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart race. Edward felt his chest tighten, the words she spoke almost too much to bear. What did she mean by serious? Could they really promise anything when the future seemed so uncertain, so out of their control? Clara took a deep breath, the cold morning air making her words seem fragile. "Let's meet again, a year from today, right here. Same time, same place." Edward's heart skipped a beat. It sounded simple enough, yet the weight of the promise lingered between them, heavy and undeniable. A year was a long time. So many things could happen, so many changes. But in that moment, it felt right. It felt like the only way to keep the connection alive, to honor the unspoken bond they shared. "Same day, same place," Edward repeated softly, almost as if he were sealing a vow with his own words. Clara nodded, her lips curving into a sad but hopeful smile. "If we're meant to be, then we'll find our way back to each other." Edward smiled too, though his heart was aching. He wanted to hold on to this moment, to make it last forever. But life had other plans. The train was ready to leave, and the reality of their separation was quickly closing in. With a final glance at each other, they both knew that this was it, their last moment together for now. The clock was ticking, and Edward's time had come. As he reached out to take Clara's hand, the contact was brief, but electric. The sensation of her skin against his sent a shock through him, one that seemed to echo deep within his chest. For a brief moment, their fingers lingered, both unwilling to let go, as though the very act of touching might somehow make the distance between them easier to bear. Then, as if time had suddenly sped up, Edward pulled back, the train's whistle blowing sharply. He quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. One of him in uniform, smiling, standing in front of the barracks. He handed it to Clara, his fingers brushing hers one last time. "Take this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "So you'll remember me." Clara took the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as she closed her hand around it. "And I'll keep it," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. until the day we meet again." As the train's doors began to close, Edward hesitated for just a moment longer, his eyes locked on Clara's. He wanted to say something, anything, to hold on to her. But words felt meaningless now. The final whistle blew, and he stepped onto the train. Clara stood there, frozen in place, watching him go. Their eyes never left each other as the train began to pull away, the distance between them growing with every passing second. But in their hearts, the promise remained. A promise they would keep, no matter the cost. Sometimes the hardest part isn't letting go. It's waiting for something that might never come. Edward stood at the train station once more, his heart heavy with a promise he had made long ago. It was the same day, the same time, the same place. Exactly 1 year since he and Clara had last seen each other. He remembered the way she had looked at him, her eyes filled with silent understanding, and the way they had exchanged their unspoken vow to meet again. But as the minutes passed, and then the hours, Edward's hope began to fade. Clara didn't come. At first he told himself she was simply running late. Perhaps something had happened, something beyond her control. He couldn't bear to think that she might not show up, that the promise they had made meant nothing. So he waited. He waited all day, standing there in the cold, watching as the station slowly emptied, the sun sinking lower into the horizon, but Clara never arrived. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He returned every year, right on the same date, at the same time, and stood there, waiting. Some years, he waited with eager anticipation, hopeful that this would be the year she finally kept her promise. Other years, he stood there quietly, the expectation still lingering in his chest, but masked by a sense of resignation. As the years passed, the initial hope he had felt began to wane, replaced by a routine. It became a ritual, this waiting, this standing in the same spot at the station, as if the act itself was all that remained of their connection. The station became a part of him. The worn benches, the smell of old trains, the sound of footsteps, echoing on the platform. It all became familiar. The faces of strangers came and went, but he was always there, waiting for a woman who never appeared. His friends and family couldn't understand. They would ask him why he kept coming back, year after year, waiting for something that seemed impossible. "Why don't you just move on, Edward? Why hold on to something that doesn't exist anymore?" they would say, their voices filled with concern. They couldn't see the promise he had made to her, the bond they had shared, the feeling that had passed between them in that fleeting moment. They didn't understand the quiet hope that still lingered in his heart, even after all this time. But Edward never blamed Clara. He never allowed himself to. He told himself there must have been a reason she didn't show up. Maybe something had happened to her. Maybe she had been prevented by circumstances beyond her control. Life, after all, was unpredictable. Perhaps she had moved on with her life, or perhaps she had simply forgotten. But none of those thoughts ever truly eased the ache in his heart. There were nights when the loneliness would settle in deep, and he would wonder if he had been foolish to keep waiting. But then he would think of Clara, her gentle smile, the way she had looked at him when they had said goodbye. The memory of her warmth, her quiet strength, was enough to keep him coming back. And so, year after year, Edward would return to the station. Sometimes he would sit on the same bench where they had last spoken, running his fingers over the worn wood, remembering the sound of her voice, the way she had spoken about the future with such calm certainty. The train station, with its echoing silence, had become his place of solitude, his place of waiting. But as time wore on, the hope faded into something more like a vow, a quiet promise he made to himself every year. He had promised Clara that he would be there. He had promised to wait, no matter how long it took. And even if she never showed up, he would keep his word. He had no other choice. The world around him had changed. Friends had come and gone, loved ones had passed, and life had continued its relentless march forward. But Edward, steadfast and silent, had remained in his own time, suspended between the past and the future, waiting for something he was no longer sure would ever come. As the years turned into decades, the station grew quieter, and fewer people recognized him. But to Edward, the waiting was never about the passage of time. It was about the promise he had made, the bond he had shared with Clara, and the hope, however faint, that one day she might return. He had never stopped waiting. Perhaps he was waiting for something that had already slipped away, but for Edward it didn't matter. The act of waiting, the remembering, the promise, it was enough. And as the years stretched on, he found solace in the thought that maybe, just maybe, Clara had kept a piece of him in her heart, just as he had kept a piece of her in his. Even if they never met again, even if they were never able to fulfill the promise they had made, their bond would remain. Quiet, unspoken, but real. Some people spend a lifetime searching for love, but for some, the heart only beats for one. Years passed, and Edward's life continued on its quiet, solitary path. He never married, never sought out another love, though there were plenty of opportunities. Friends and family had tried over the years to set him up with women, kind, gentle women who would have been perfect companions. But Edward always politely refused, offering a quiet smile and a simple explanation that was both true and final. "I have loved once. That's enough," he would say. At first people didn't understand. How could he turn away from the chance of love again? How could he resist the prospect of a second chance at happiness? But Edward never wavered in his response. He had given his heart to Clara, and that was enough. He had made a promise to her, and in a way, he had kept it, by choosing to remain true to the feelings they had shared, even if she had never returned, to fulfill the promise they made. Edward lived simply, his days filled with teaching and tending to the small garden he had cultivated over the years. He found peace in the rhythms of daily life, the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind, the slow growth of plants, the way the world changed around him while he remained grounded in his own small corner of it. Teaching brought him a sense of purpose. He enjoyed the act of passing on knowledge, of shaping young minds, but even more, he found solace in the routine of it all. The classroom was a place where time moved differently, where the past and future seemed to blur, and he could focus on something other than the emptiness of his own heart. His garden, too, was a quiet source of comfort. Edward spent hours tending to the plants, watching as they grew and bloomed, as though they were a reflection of his own life. A quiet, steady progression, each small step a victory. The act of nurturing something, of caring for it, brought him peace. It was the same peace he found in the silence of his home, in the empty space where a wife and children might have been, had things been different, but it was a peaceful solitude, one that he had chosen for himself. There were, of course, moments of loneliness. There were nights when the silence felt too heavy, when the house seemed too empty, and the world outside too loud and bustling. In those moments, Edward would think back to Clara, to the years they had shared and the promise they had made. He never felt resentment. He never felt anger. What he felt was simply a quiet ache, a longing for something that could never be, but also a deep understanding that it wasn't meant to be. He had loved once, and that love had been enough. He had given all of himself to that one fleeting, beautiful moment, and in return, it had shaped the rest of his life. Clara had been his only love, and he had no regrets. He didn't need another love, another connection, to feel whole. The love he had for her had sustained him, kept him grounded in a world that often felt too chaotic. In the end, that love, even without the promise of a reunion, was enough. Friends would sometimes ask him if he was lonely, if he missed the companionship of a woman. They didn't understand that the love he had lost was not something to be replaced, but something that had become a part of him. He was content in his solitude, not because he was afraid of love, but because he had already given his heart to someone who would never leave it. And so, Edward lived his life quietly, with no desire for anything more. He had loved once, and that was enough. Sometimes, the past holds secrets that need to be uncovered, no matter the cost. Lena was just a young journalism student, with a passion for uncovering stories that the world had forgotten. She had always been curious, always wanted to know the why behind the things that others simply accepted as fact. It was this curiosity that led her to Edward, an elderly man who had lived in the same town for as long as anyone could remember. It was on a rainy afternoon when Lena first met him. She had been wandering the streets of the small town, taking photographs for an assignment on local history, when she noticed Edward sitting alone on a bench at the park. His presence was striking. There was an air of quiet dignity about him, and yet his isolation caught her attention. She struck up a conversation with him, initially out of politeness, but something about his demeanor intrigued her. He was kind, but distant, his answers short yet thoughtful. As they talked, Lena couldn't help but notice the oddity in his routine. Every year, he returned to the same bench, in the same park, on the same day. She asked him about it, and he simply smiled. "It's a promise," he said. The way he said it with such calm certainty piqued her curiosity. What kind of promise could have kept a man so dedicated for so long? Lena couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind Edward's quiet waiting, a story that he had never shared with anyone. Determined to find out more, Lena made it her mission to uncover the truth. She began by digging into the town's archives, searching for any mention of Edward and a woman named Clara. After hours of research, she came across an old newspaper article from 1972. It spoke of a young woman named Clara who had been involved in a car accident the same year she had met Edward. The article mentioned that she had lost her memory for several months after the accident and had left the town shortly after her recovery. Lena's heart raced as she connected the dots. This was the Clara Edward had been waiting for. But what had happened to her after the accident? Why had she never returned to keep the promise they had made? Driven by the need for answers, Lena traveled to the town where Clara had once lived, a small, quiet village about 2 hours away. It was a place untouched by time, where the houses looked as though they had been there for generations, and the streets were lined with memories. Lena visited Clara's old home, now abandoned and covered in ivy. She knocked on the door of the neighbors, hoping for some insight. After some hesitation, an elderly woman invited her in and began to tell Lena about Clara's life after the accident. The woman explained how Clara had struggled with her memory loss and how, once she had recovered, she had left without a word, disappearing into the unknown. The woman had heard rumors that Clara had moved to another city, but no one knew for sure where she had gone. Lena felt a pang of sadness as she listened to the woman's story. Clara had never come back to fulfill the promise she had made to Edward. The accident, the memory loss, the sudden departure. It all made sense now. Clara had never intended to break her promise. It was fate, cruel and unpredictable, that had torn them apart. Returning to the town, Lena couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sympathy for Edward. He had waited for a woman who had never been able to keep her word, not because she didn't want to, but because life had taken her in a different direction. Lena now understood the depth of his devotion. The promise he had made to Clara was not just a simple vow. It was the thread that had kept him tethered to the past, to a love that was lost but never forgotten. Lena approached Edward one last time, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had uncovered. She sat beside him on the bench, and this time, she didn't ask questions. She simply sat in silence with him, knowing that some stories, some promises, are too sacred to be. Sometimes love is a promise made in the heart that the world cannot fulfill. The truth, when it came, was far more heartbreaking than either of them could have ever imagined. Clara had indeed returned to the park that day, the same day Edward had kept his vigil for all those years, but fate, cruel and indifferent, had played a trick on them both. She had arrived a day too late. It was the 3rd of November. Clara had been there, waiting, her heart racing with the hope that Edward would keep his promise. She had told herself she would wait for as long as it took. She believed that the bond they shared, the connection that had never faded in her heart, would bring her back to him, no matter the time or distance. But as the day wore on, her hope began to fade. The hours stretched out, and with each passing moment, the park grew emptier, the benches more forlorn, and Clara's heart heavier with disappointment. She waited until the last train left, but Edward never came. Confused and heartbroken, Clara had left, never knowing that Edward had stood in the same place a day later, waiting for her, his heart as full of hope as hers. In the months that followed, Clara, unable to understand why their meeting never took place, left the town. She moved abroad, seeking to rebuild her life, though a part of her always carried the ache of the promise unfulfilled. She never spoke of it again, burying it deep within herself, the love that could have been, but was never, realized. Years later, when Lena finally uncovered the truth, it was not just a matter of finding Clara's name or the town where she had lived. It was about finding Clara herself, finding the woman who had once held the same promise that Edward had kept all his life. Lena tracked Clara down, now living in a quiet village across the ocean. The meeting, though bittersweet, was inevitable. When Lena met Clara, she didn't have to ask many questions. The look in Clara's eyes said everything. The moment Lena spoke of Edward, of the man who had waited for her all these years, Clara's face softened with both sorrow and understanding. Clara told Lena her side of the story, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I waited," she whispered, the words heavy with regret. "I thought he would come, that I was just a day too early. But when I realized I had missed him, I left. I couldn't stay in the place where I had made that promise." Knowing it was broken, Lena's heart ached for both of them. They had both waited, both had loved. Yet time, fate, and circumstance had conspired to keep them apart. There had never been a moment for them to meet again, and the love they had shared, so beautiful and true, remained a whispered memory, never allowed to grow into the life they had imagined. Clara handed Lena a letter, an old, yellowed piece of paper that had been kept hidden in her belongings for decades. It was addressed to Edward, written years ago, on the eve of her departure. In it, Clara confessed her love for him, apologized for not being able to keep their promise, and shared her hopes that, somehow, they would both find peace. "I've loved you," the letter read. "And I've waited. I've always wondered if you were waiting too. But the world? It has a way of slipping through our fingers, doesn't it? If you're still out there, I hope you know, I never stopped loving you." Lena returned to Edward with the letter, now understanding the depth of the love they had shared. She found him in the same park, where it all began, his figure as still as ever. As she handed him Clara's words, Edward's eyes filled with tears, though he did not speak. He had always known the truth deep in his heart, but hearing it from Clara, after all these years, was both a relief and a pain that could never truly heal. The love they had was a quiet love, one not bound by time or distance, but by the promise they made to each other. And though they never had the chance to say goodbye, their love would live on in the hearts of those who knew their story. Two people who had waited for each other, but were never able to meet again. He didn't die from losing love. He lived fully because he had once loved truly. The park was quiet, as it had always been, with the trees swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. The bench, the very same bench where Edward had waited for so many years, sat empty for the first time in a long time. The town, too, seemed to have slowed, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Edward returned to the park one final time, his slow, steady steps guided by a quiet determination. In his hand, he held the letter from Clara, the letter that had finally connected the past with the present, the letter that had revealed the truth they both had carried silently all these years. He walked slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of a lifetime of waiting, and sat on the bench where he had once spent countless hours hoping, dreaming, and wishing for the love he never thought he would have. He unfolded the letter, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from the emotional storm that had washed over him in the wake of the discovery. The words were simple, yet profound, and they carried with them the love that had never faded, only been buried under the weight of time and circumstance. As he read the final words, his eyes began to blur with tears. "I never stopped loving you. I never stopped waiting," Clara had written. And though it was a love that could never fully be realized, it was a love that had shaped his life in ways he could never have explained. He had lived because of it. He had waited, and in waiting, he had loved. Edward closed his eyes slowly, as if to hear her voice, as if to feel her presence beside him, the way it had been so many years ago. The park, the bench, the town, everything seemed to fade away, and for a moment, there was only silence. He could almost hear Clara's laughter, could almost feel her hand in his, just as they had dreamed so many years ago. He didn't need words anymore. He didn't need to see her face. In this quiet moment, with the letter in his hands, he knew she was with him, in the place where time had stopped. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, a peaceful smile on his face, as though he had finally found the closure he had been searching for all his life. Then, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the empty bench, Edward slowly stood. He placed the letter gently on the seat, a final tribute to the love he had always carried in his heart. The camera lingered on the bench for a long moment, the only movement the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees. The old photograph, now placed on the seat beside the letter, showed Edward and Clara, young and hopeful, before time and fate had taken their toll. The picture was faded, like the memories, but still powerful in its simplicity. The bench sat, empty now, as it had been so many times before, but the story wasn't finished. The love that had endured silently for all those years would never truly fade. The story of Edward and Clara is one of timeless love, a love that transcends time, space, and circumstance. It's a love that speaks not through grand gestures or dramatic reunions, but through quiet moments of waiting, hope, and commitment. Edward's journey shows us that love doesn't always need to be spoken aloud to be real. Sometimes the deepest loves are the ones that live in our hearts silently, enduring the passage of time and the trials of life. Through this story, we are reminded that the greatest promises are those made in silence and kept in our hearts. Sometimes, it's not about finding closure, but about finding peace in the love we've given. We are all capable of waiting for the ones we love, and sometimes the waiting itself is what shapes us, what gives our lives meaning. What do you think about Edward's choice to wait for Clara all those years? Was it worth it? Could you wait for someone you loved, even when the world told you to move on? This story challenges us to think about our own lives, our own loves, and the promises we make. How do we honor the people we love, even when they are no longer with us? Do we let go, or do we keep waiting, silently holding on to what was? If Edward and Clara's love has touched your heart, join us as we continue to share stories that inspire, move, and make us think deeply about the connections we make in this world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. There are many more heartfelt tales to come, and we would love for you to be a part of our community. Join the journey, and let's keep exploring the story